In this video, I'm gonna show you 3 input validation design ideas that you can use in your own project. And the first one, which is the username, I'm using a hint text and the placeholder text to show the user how a valid username should look like. And I also use a checkmark symbol for validation feedback. If the username is valid, the input field will get a green border and the checkmark symbol will be green as well. So if I remove the number, it's not valid, it's valid. The next one, which is the email, I'm only using placeholder text. And as the user starts writing the email address, a red arrow message pops up in the left corner stating that the email value is not valid yet. And as I go on writing a valid email, the red arrow message transitions to a green checkmark symbol. And the last one, which is the password, I'm also using hint text with 3 criterias. Each criteria has its own checkmark symbol. As the value matches a criteria, the checkmark symbol next to the criteria will turn green. So 8 characters, 1 number and 1 special character. And if I remove it, you can see it's not valid. I hope you like this. Let's jump on the code now. First, I create the HTML structure for the project. I start with a new index.html file. Start with a new section, then a form. You can delete the action attribute, not gonna need that now. Inside the form comes the 3 input fields, starting with the username. The username input will get a unique design, so I wrap it inside a custom div. Then I start with the label for the username, value username. And if you remember, we had a hint text below the label, which I'm going to add now with the ID of information. 8 or more characters with at least 1 number. And below the hint text comes the input field, which in this case is going to be a text. The name, username, ID, username as well, placeholder, maballs 8, and this is going to be a required field. And if you remember, we also had a checkmark icon in the input field. So for that, I'm going to use a span with the ID of indicator and the checkmark symbol x2714. And we also have an error message to wrap this up. The next one is going to be the email. So I start with the label for email, value email. The input will be email, of course. Name email, ID email. Placeholder, lickmaballs.com. And this is going to be required as well. And below the input field comes the error message, email error, and class name error. And the last one, which is the password, label password. The input field is going to be password as well. Name password, ID password. No placeholder, and it's going to be required. If you remember, below the password field we had 3 criterias. So I start with a p tag, then a span with the ID of password length and the class name of icon. So this is going to be the checkmark icon. And here comes the x2714, the HTML checkmark symbol, and then the actual criteria, at least 8 characters. And I'm gonna duplicate this 2 more times to be faster. Password number, at least 1 number, zero to 9, and the third one is password special, at least 1 special character. And of course we're going to need a submit button. The type will be submit, the text is submit. And this is the HTML code we need for this project. If I go and open live server, you can see that something here is not working properly. This isn't the checkmark icon. Yeah, the issue here, this has to be a 4 at the end, not a 2. If I open live server again, you can see everything looks perfect. Okay, let's close this one. Close live server. Now that the HTML is finalized, I'm going to jump on the CSS. So first I create a new folder called style. Inside this folder I create a style.css file, and I start defining some global variables for the colors. With the help of the root selector, I can define global reusable variables for the colors. I have a dark gray 131, a light gray, validation color, valid, which is a green, obviously, an error color, which is a red, and the plain white for the fonts, which is thus just for Fs. After defining the colors, I'm going to have a few root specifications. Padding should be 0 pixel. Margin should be 0 pixel as well. And for the font, I'm going to use Poppins, but you can use any font you like. After defining the root specifications, I'm going to jump on the layout. Starting with the body. It's gonna have a background color, and we are using the variables we defined earlier. Display flex, justify content center, also line item center because we want everything centered, and we give a height of 100 view height just to fill up the whole screen. After the body comes the section. The section will also have a background color, but this is different. It's dark gray. Max width 500 pixels. Display flex. Justify content center. Align items center as well. A width of 100%. And a border radius 10 px. Okay, we're going to style the form CSS. The form should have a width of 100% and a padding of 30 pixels. Inside the form we have the divs that should display flex direction column, and the margin bottom 10 px to divide each other. Label will have a color of our white. Font size 16 pixels. And font weight 500. After the label, I style the input fields. The input fields should have a background color of light gray. The value color should be white. Padding 10 px. Border, it's a 2 px solid light gray as well. Border radius 5 px. Outline none. Font size 16 pixels. Font weight 300. And also transition all 500 milliseconds. when you click into the input field is the focus state. In the focus state, we're going to have a border of 2px solid white, and inside the input at the email we have a placeholder that needs some styling as well. So the input placeholder should have an opacity of 0.3, font style italic, and font weight 300. And we also have a submit button. The background color valid, color dark gray, width 100%, padding 10px, border style none, border radius 5px, font size 18 pixels, font weight 600, text transform uppercase, and the cursor pointer obviously. Last but not least, the p tag should have white color, font size 13 pixels, and the font weight of 400. After the form, I designed the input fields, starting with the username. If you remember, the username input had a checkmark icon inside of it. In order to achieve that outcome, I wrapped both the input field and the checkmark icon inside a custom div called input wrapper. And with the help of some CSS positioning, I can make it appear like the checkmark icon is inside of the input field. So I have to give this element a position relative, and then the checkmark icon, which had the indicator ID, will get the position absolute. By this, I can practically move it around inside the input wrapper. So I give a right 15 pixel and the top 57% to place where I want, and it will have the color of plain white and opacity of 0.0. I also had a hint text above the input field, which had information ID. This will have a white color as well, font size 13 pixels, margin bottom 3px, opacity of 0.7 because I don't want it to be bright white. And I also add the CSS selectors for the valid case. So the username is valid, which is the username input. It will get the valid border color, and the indicator, which is the checkmark icon, if it's valid, it will also get the valid color, and the opacity of 1. After the username comes the email input field. The email input field had an error text, which will get the color of error, the height of 10px. The email error will get text aligned right, because we want it aligned to the right side of our input field. And if it's valid, it will turn into a green checkmark icon. So email error valid will get the color of valid. And last but not least, the password input. The icon, which is the checkmark icon next to each criteria, will get the color of plain white. And if it's valid, the criteria is valid, it will get the valid color. Okay, so now we have to add the CSS. We have to link the CSS file to our HTML document. Link rel style sheet href, and we have the style sheet inside of the style folder, so style/style.css. When it's done, we can go and check out the live server, and you can see everything looks just perfect. Let me zoom in a little bit, so you can see that everything is aligned perfectly. Now the final part is the JavaScript. So I close this and I create a new folder called script. Inside this folder I create a script.js file. First I have to grab all the elements we'll need to make this working, starting with the form. It's document dot query selector form. Then the username input, document dot get element by id, username, const indicator, document dot get element by id indicator, email input, const email input equals document dot get element by id email, const email error equals document dot get element by ID email error, and the password fields const password input equals document dot get element by ID password const password length. I have to grab all the criteria icons. Document dot get element by ID password length, and I'm going to duplicate these 2 more times to be much faster. So the second one was number, password number, and password special. The last one, password special. Great. Now that I grabbed all the elements I need, I go on with the validation, starting with the username. The username input will get an event listener that will listen to the key up event, which executes whenever the user releases a key while typing into the input field. This dynamically validates the input field, providing an immediate feedback to the user. The event listener also takes the event object as a parameter, from which I can extract the username value, the current username value. Const username equals event dot target dot value. Now I set up the validation process. If username dot length is greater or equals 8 and username contains at least 1 digit, this is a regex for checking if the value contains a digit or not, execute the following code. In this bracket, we'll also use an if statement where we are checking if the username input already has the class list of valid class list dot contains valid. If it contains valid, if it doesn't contains valid, username input will be added, will get the valid class, and simultaneously the indicator, which is the checkmark icon, will get the valid class as well. Else, any other case, the username input will be removed and the indicator valid class list will be removed as well. The next one is the email input validation. This will look similar. Email input dot add event listener. We are also listening to the key up event. We also use the event object as parameter because we will need the current value of the email. Const email equals event dot target dot value. And I also create another variable called regex, which will contain a basic regex for emails. This regex checks whether or not the email is valid, like contains a red symbol, after the dot is at least 2 characters, and so on. The validation process will look like this. If regex dot test email, so this tests the email whenever the user types something, checks the email if it's valid or not based on the regex we provided. If it's valid, email error dot class list add valid. So the email error will get the valid class name, and the email error inner HTML will be changed to the checkmark symbol. If it's not valid, email error dot class list dot remove valid, and the email error will get text content that equals please provide valid email address. And the third one, which is the password, no surprise, I also gonna use the add event listener, the password input dot add event listener listens to the key up event and takes the event object as a parameter, from which I will extract the password value. Const password equals event dot target dot value. The password validation will have 3 elements, starting with the password length. We'll toggle the class of valid based on our criteria. So toggle valid, check the password length is equals or greater than 8. The second one is password number dot class list dot toggle valid. Check if the password contains a number and test it for this criteria. And the third one is the special class list dot toggle valid, and we use special regex that checks if the password contains any special character like @ symbol, $sign, etc. This is all the JavaScript code we'll need to validate every input field in our code. Now, the last thing we'll need is to add this JavaScript to our HTML file, which I'm going to put here before the closing body tag. So script source script.js. By placing the script before the closing body tag, I make sure that the whole DOM content is loaded before I execute my JavaScript. We're all set now. If you go to the live server, zoom in a little bit, I can check if everything works properly. My balls 8, it's valid. Email lickmaballs.com, it's working properly, and the password 8 characters, 1 number and 1 special.